Phil Walker, FAICP, is a principal of the Walker Collaborative and has nearly 35 years of professional planning experience in planning and downtown revitalization. He has served as a downtown director in Pensacola, Florida, and a city planning director in Natchez, Mississippi. He also worked for planning consulting firms in Princeton, New Jersey, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, before starting his Nashville-based practice in 2002. He has led the preparation of dozens of downtown master plans across the country. Phil has helped the communities of Clarksville, Tennessee, and Natchez, Mississippi start new downtown revitalization entities by serving as their interim executive director. His book, Downtown Planning for Smaller and Mid-Sized Communities, was published in 2009. His education includes degrees in historic preservation, urban planning, and real estate development. So we are pleased to have Phil Walker with us this morning.
Thank you, Thomas. It's good to be here, and what a conference this has been. I mean, we're winding down, but I've got to congratulate Thomas on doing such a great job pulling it all together. In the face of adversity, COVID, rain, even for outdoor events, things like that, but it's gone great. So this talk, I've given several talks in the past about downtown planning, but I've never given one kind of with this focus, because it finally dawned on me that, if you can't if you can't convince people with the money, city governments, whoever, to do a plan, then the rest of it's kind of a moot point, right? Likewise, if you can get the money for a plan and you do it, if you can't successfully implement it, again, it's not much is achieved. So that's why I wanted to kind of focus. I talk a little bit about the planning substance of it in the middle, but mainly it's about how you initiate, how you build the support to do a plan, and then how you successfully implement a plan. So here's a slide where I tell you what I'm going to tell you. So we're going to first talk about why you prepare a plan, and a lot of that's kind of talking points that you can use when you're trying to convince other people that you need a downtown plan. Building support and funding for a plan, the do's and don'ts of a plan process and content, and then finally, probably the majority of the slides here relate to lessons in plan implementation. So the selling points, and again, these are sort of the talking points on why your community might need a downtown plan, are number one, to build consensus. That way, everybody's kind of rowing in the same direction. You don't have a bunch of competing agendas. Secondly, to benefit the broader economy and the image of your community. Because let's face it, people judge a community by its downtown. It's just that simple. And so if you've got a rundown downtown, it reflects on the broader community. It's harder to get economic development, even on a broader scale outside of your downtown, to occur. You need it to enhance the quality of life, not just for the sake of citizens, which should be enough, right? But also for business development. If you're trying to recruit new industry, new business, these people are looking for a good quality of life if they're going to move their company there. A lot of them have little checklists. I want to see greenways. I want to see bike lanes. I want to see a vibrant downtown, right? Because they, in turn, might have to attract bright, creative people to work for them, and they've got to have the kind of place that those sorts of folks might want to actually move to. Fiscal efficiency, in other words, coming up with a plan that has specific recommendations for physical improvements so that you can really be efficient in how you make those decisions and move forward. Preserving a sense of place. You've probably heard the term generica, America that looks generic. Think about outside of your downtown. If you're looking at a typical strip commercial area, Starkville, Mississippi can look like Des Moines. There's not much difference. It's franchise architecture, right? But your downtown is that one opportunity to really have a sense of place. That's kind of what sets you apart and makes you look different. Securing funding for projects. A lot of communities have found they have success when they go after grants for a specific project. If they can tie that to a broader plan, then they're going to be a lot more competitive. Because anytime you go after a grant, you're obviously competing with other communities for those same dollars. And then finally, to use it as a marketing tool. Now, that doesn't mean that a business person that's thinking about opening a business in your community is necessarily going to want to read through a 150-page document, but most downtown plans include an executive summary, which kind of functions as a marketing piece, and if they're interested, they can read further in the whole plan. So what is it that would prompt a downtown plan to occur? And I'm going to take my watch off so I can keep an eye and not go over. So sometimes it's simply the passage of time. And 5 years is kind of a rule of thumb. For example, in states that mandate, I've never seen a state that mandates downtown planning, but there are states that mandate citywide comprehensive plans, and those states typically say you got to update it every 5 years. And that's a good rule of thumb. You know, in about a 5-year period, if you've done a downtown plan, things have probably changed enough that it's time to kind of relook at it. New circumstances, and that can be good or it could be negative circumstances. I remember in the early 90s, I worked on several downtown plans that were tied to casino gambling. You know, there was like this national outbreak. It started in the Midwest, came down to Mississippi, Louisiana. So a lot of communities were doing downtown plans because they figured, okay, we want to mitigate any negative impacts. We want to maximize potential positive impacts. So that kind of thing can happen. Transportation changes. Maybe there's been a bypass built and suddenly you're not getting the same traffic flow through your downtown. Or in the case of Lexington, North Carolina, they actually had became a stop on Amtrak, and for that reason they decided to do a downtown master plan because a railroad station was downtown. Changing economic conditions, and again, it could be positive or negative. Way back in the late 90s, I led a plan for Nashville's Music Row area, and what triggered it was the Country Music Hall of Fame, which was a small little facility in Music Row, was moving downtown to a really big, nice new thing, but there were all these little tourist-oriented, like T-shirt shops and things like that around the old Country Music Hall of Fame, and the merchants and property owners were really upset and concerned. And so I think almost for more political reasons than anything, Metro Nashville had this plan done that I led. But again, it was that change that prompted it. Image problems. Maybe there's crime that's been highly publicized. Maybe a major anchor is closed. And then sometimes just simply available funding. Kentucky, for example, I don't even know if they still have it, but it's called the Renaissance Program, where they had a big pool of money that they would give out to communities that would do downtown master plans. So those are just some of the things that might prompt a plan. So let's talk about building support and funding. So with building support, I mean, one thing you want to do is obviously the talking points I just went over. You know, that's something you can utilize when you're talking to elected officials or whoever might decide on this stuff. One way is to make sure that when you have other plans, they recommend a downtown master plan. For example, if you do a citywide comprehensive plan, you know, a lot of times that plan might say, hey, you know, you need to really focus on your downtown more than a general citywide comprehensive plan can. So that's one way to kind of get that in there. You might organize a field trip to some model downtown. And we've all seen this Chamber of Commerces that go on these annual trips to some community that they study. When I was the interim director in Clarksville, Tennessee, they decided to go to the Quad Cities in Illinois and Iowa, and because they had riverfronts and they had downtowns and they'd done some pretty good things, and that's why the folks in Clarksville decided to go study that community. You might use a dog and pony show. For example, you might bring the city to the show. Maybe there's a conference. I spoke in Russellville, Arkansas some years ago on downtown planning, and they managed to get their city representatives there, and they were sold on downtown planning, and they did a master plan. So that's kind of bringing your people to the show, or bring the show to your people. You know, I presented like in Northport, Alabama, where we then did a downtown plan. Same thing in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and Brenham, Texas. So that's another way. I got to give you a warning, though. So this is kind of a funny story. It happened a couple of years ago, and I was asked to go to New Albany, Mississippi, not far from here, a little bit north, to talk about a citywide comprehensive plan, not downtown, but comprehensive plan. So I was invited to go down there and give a talk. And the person who organized it was a newly elected official, and so consequently, she didn't realize that she needed to have it advertised because she was getting together, I think, the mayor and council. I can't remember who all. So there I am, giving a presentation on the merits of doing a citywide comprehensive plan, and the local media guy finds out and shows up, and, you know, it was like he'd caught us red-handed doing something, you know, secretive, when in fact, as you can see I've circled, it was held at the Magnolia Civic Center. So I don't know how many clandestine meetings are held in a civic center, but still, you know, obviously a mistake was made, it wasn't advertised. So I had to kind of pull away. Luckily, my friend Bob Barber was able to pick up the pieces, and he did the plan. But anyway, if you do this kind of dog and pony show, just make sure that you advertise it if that's going to be a legal requirement. Because that could have derailed the whole project, actually. but luckily it didn't. Okay, let's talk about funding a plan. So the most common approach is that city government funds it. If it's a county seat, sometimes the county might chip in. Another thing is leveraging programs. I mentioned before that Kentucky had this Renaissance program, and that's how Murray, Kentucky got their downtown plan funded. In Covington, Louisiana, there's an organization called the North Shore Community Foundation, and they focus on the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain, in the New Orleans area, and they hand out pretty big chunks of money to communities to do planning. So we did this plan for what's called the West 30s area that included their downtown as a secondary area, mainly focused on a challenged neighborhood for the most part. But one thing to be careful about, there's a reason why when you get a grant, there's usually a match required of some amount, so you have a little skin in the game, right? And in this case, they really didn't, and while the city supported the project, that is the city of Covington, I never got the sense that they bought in quite to the extent that they had to fund it themselves that they would have. So that's, but you do want to utilize, obviously, sources like that. You just need to make sure that there's full commitment behind it. Now, the most interesting example of funding a plan, and I've never heard of this happening, is purely by private dollars being written. So in Natchez, Mississippi, where I used to be the planning director years ago, there were some folks interested in doing a downtown plan. Well, the city didn't have any money. They were just broke. So they had me go down and do some dog and pony shows about the merits of doing a downtown plan. And then they started this big fundraising campaign. They got over 300 individual checks. None of them were allowed to be more than $5,000, except the Historic Natchez Foundation, which gave $10,000. They raised over $100,000 for us to do the master plan. My favorite, though, was sitting down and meeting with a guy who decades earlier when I was a planning director had threatened to have me fired because he didn't like regulations, right? And he pulled out his checkbook and wrote a $5,000 check. I felt like I'd pulled a thorn out of his paw, right? It was pretty gratifying. But that's like a really rare situation when it's private dollars, but it's not unusual for maybe major corporations to chip in money on something like this. I mean, the plan of Chicago back in the 20s was all private funding by corporations. So now let me switch over to the do's and don'ts of a plan, process, and content. I'm going to start with the do's. Do involve the Main Street program. In fact, when I did plans for Murray, Kentucky, and Russellville, Arkansas, they were the actual client. Now, the money for the plans came from the city, but the client technically was the Main Street program. Every now and then I'll see a RFP, request for proposal, and there's no mention of a Main Street program, right? It's like from the city. It's all city-driven. And then I start researching the place, and I find out, wow, they have a Main Street program. That always raises a red flag for me. It's like, maybe the city doesn't take the Main Street program seriously enough, or just leaves them out of the loop. And I'm sure you've all seen that. So obviously, it's important that the Main Street program, if there is one, is heavily involved with the plan. Also, it's important to appoint a project steering committee, and it should be pretty representative of different types of stakeholders. They kind of set the tone for the project. Most people have some kind of constituency, whether it's people they go to church with or people in their neighborhood or some, maybe they serve on some governmental body, but they can kind of communicate back to their constituents as to what's going on. They can serve as a sounding board for when it comes to public engagement. Public engagement is so important nowadays, but if you're a consultant from somewhere else, you might have used a lot of different tools, but you don't know what specific tools are going to work in that community. So that's why a steering committee can be really helpful to kind of figure out the strategy. What's going to get people in this community out to meetings or to otherwise be engaged? And then when the plan's finished, they can become sort of cheerleaders to get the plan adopted. And then they put on a different hat and they become the implementation committee. Now, you might lose a few folks because, maybe they didn't have time in the first go around with the plan. Maybe you meet new people that you think, hey, we need to involve them, but they should turn into an implementation committee. They should probably meet at least monthly. You need to have staff, because what happens is the staff person, maybe the planning director or whoever, they look at their calendar and they go, oh, the steering committee or implementation committee is going to meet in a week. I got to have something done here. So that's what kind of helps keep the implementation going along. Another do take a holistic approach. In other words, the Main Street 4-point approach, which I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with. I'm always amazed at how many communities, when they do a downtown master plan, they focus just on physical improvements, right? Even in communities that have a Main Street program. And so I think when you do a master plan, it needs to address all four of the 4 points. And that means you need a comprehensive, a team that's comprehensive as far as different disciplines, including an economist is always pretty important, I think. When it comes to kind of the process, generally there are at least 4 basic steps. And sometimes I break this into 5 or 6, depending on how it works out. But first of all, you'll want to have, research and analysis is at the front end. That's kind of the diagnostic stage, right? The next step, and you might have a whole visioning process as an intermediate step in there too. Number 2, concept plan creation. Usually that's done through a charrette, where you have, I call it a multi-day intensive brainstorming session that heavily engages the public to come up with the creative basic ideas for a plan. That's a mouthful. In fact, I just led one last week, Thursday in Anniston, Alabama, and we did our presentation of the concept plan this Monday. It had to straddle a weekend, unfortunately, for me. But anyway, that's sort of where you come up with the ideas. Typically on the front end of that with the workshop, you'll have, you present your findings so far. You break people up into teams. These are citizens that are, each table has a big base map and maybe 8 to 10 people around it. They have colored markers. The markers tie to some issue. There's kind of like a legend for that. And you walk them through a process. I call it deputizing citizens to be planners for the evening. And each team comes up with their ideas over maybe 1 hour, 1.5 hour period. And then at the end, they all present their ideas. And sometimes there's some ideas that are kind of wacky, that may not be viable, but there's always some good ones in there too that we can. But the main thing is that they're getting a sense of ownership in the project, regardless of what the outcome of ideas might be. So that's important. Let me go to the don'ts. And some of these are kind of like, don't try this at home, right? Some of them are kind of silly, but just to break up the talk, don't plan a pedestrian mall closed to vehicular traffic. Now, we get this idea all the time. Like every time I do a charrette, the workshop is like, hey, well, let's shut down Main Street. I'm like, now that can work in very unique situations, right? And having removable bollards to block it off for an event, that's totally fine. But you don't know how many downtowns have been killed by cutting it off to traffic. Even major cities, like my hometown, Louisville, Kentucky, they did that on 4th Street, closed it off, they had to reopen it. They did the same thing in Memphis with Main Street, had to reopen it. So I can only think of some unique situations. Charlottesville, Virginia, it's a college town. They have one that works. Burlington, Vermont, there are some around and in major cities, but in most typical small communities, it's probably not going to work. Don't retain or create one-way streets. Now, one-way streets, there's no historic basis. They all came about in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when traffic engineers had one goal, to move vehicles as quickly and efficiently as possible, right? No thought of, pedestrian-friendly environments. And there's a lot of problems with one-way streets. Number one, it encourages speeding because you don't have folks what traffic engineers call friction, people moving the opposite direction. So just psychologically, you go faster. If you're a visitor and you want to be visitor-friendly, right, with your downtown, it can be confusing to get somewhere. The retail visibility is less. And then finally, out-of-trip driving. You may be at an intersection and you see right where you want to go, but to get there, you got to go a block, take a right, that kind of thing. So some examples. This is Natchez, where we just did a downtown master plan a couple years ago, and our plan said convert all these one-ways to two-ways, and take a look at how easy it would be. This is Main Street. You can picture a yellow stripe being here and flipping around the direction of the cars. It could work really easily. All you'd have to do some signage changes, but guess what? They don't want to change. So it continues to be one-way, the series of one-way streets. Russellville, Arkansas, really interesting there. They have two-way streets. I got a call from their Main Street person, this is like 6 months ago or something like that, because somebody wanted to convert a block of downtown Russellville from two-way to one-way. Now, it wouldn't have been tragic if that had happened because it was one block and there were some circumstances, but generally speaking, I said, no, it's probably not a good idea. I think it's still two-way for that block. This is really crazy. So Oxford, Alabama is immediately south of Anniston, where I've been all this week. And I just, in checking out, and this wasn't a downtown plan, it was a citywide comprehensive plan that I'm doing there. and I decided to check out Oxford, see what it was like. So I go there, and this is what they have, this really wide street. It's one way, goes that way, and they've got these parking bays that are, all you need is 8 feet for a parking lane. It's at least 12, maybe 14 feet wide. So I thought, wow, that's pretty crazy. So for this presentation, I plop this in there, I kind of blow it up, and it's kind of low resolution. So I think, okay, I'm going to get on Google Earth, street level, see if I get a higher resolution version of this. I go there, and if you look at Google Earth, they have the date that the image comes from. Well, it's from 2019. Guess what they had? Two-way traffic in 2019. So they must have gone out, found this 1960s, 70s era traffic guy, dusted him off, him or her, and said, hey, can you make our two-way street a one-way street? So it's still happening is the bottom line, which just kind of blows my mind. Another one, don't locate major community facilities outside of your downtown. Now, I should have put a caveat, like if it's a prison, yeah, maybe that's not downtown. But there are some exceptions. But when it comes to something like a library or whatever, so years ago, I led a downtown plan for Natchitoches, Louisiana. And I don't know if you've heard of Natchitoches. They filmed Steel Magnolias there. Beautiful town. So when our consultant team got to town for the first trip, we sit down with the mayor and some other leaders, and we said, okay, first of all, what do you have on the drawing board? Are there any projects planned or anything that we need to know about? And so they said, well, we're going to do a conference center. We got a $2 million grant from the state for this conference center. We said, hey, that's great. Where downtown are you going to put it? Oh, we're not putting it downtown. We're putting it out at the highway, right out here. Here's downtown, by the way. We're putting it out the highway. We said, why are you doing that? They said, well, because we're getting a free piece of land from the guy that owns a Holiday Inn next door. And we said, I know it's attractive to get a free piece of land, but you don't want to kind of shift your economic center of gravity out here. That conference center needs to be downtown. And they said, well, we can't do that because the grant was site-specific, to this site. And if we wanted to do it downtown, we'd have to go back through the process. We might jeopardize the grant. We'd have to now pay, a couple $100,000 at least for a piece of downtown property and all that stuff. And we kept telling them, you need to do it. To their credit, they reversed the decision. They went through the process, still got to keep the grant money, and they put it downtown, and it made a big difference for their downtown, or at least initially. I haven't checked lately, but I think it really has helped quite a bit. Oh, good. Thank you. And if it hadn't been for a plan, just think if we'd shown up a month later or something, it might be out the highway.
They're building something there now on that piece of land. The iron's already up.
Okay.
We have no idea. We don't know what it is.
Interesting. Wow. Okay, now this is going to sound really nitpicky. It's like a pet peeve of mine. Don't use evergreen trees for street trees. They branch out really low. So you got to prune them up. I mean, you can't even walk under these, actually. They don't have a real broad canopy, and they keep their leaves even when you don't want leaves, like in the wintertime when you might want a little sunshine coming in, right? Poor North Carolina, they've got a lot of their downtowns have holly trees as street trees. Why? Because of Holly Farms Chicken. Holly Farms Chicken was giving holly trees for free to these downtowns. And, I just wish they'd been called like Crepe Myrtle Chicken or something like, farms that is, or maybe Maple Farms. I don't know what a really good street tree is, but it definitely isn't a holly, So unfortunate for that name of the company, right? Birds? Ah, yeah. Now, don't build a skyscraper-scaled structure in your little downtown. So especially what you don't want to do, this is Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is not far from me. I'm in Nashville. So the most important building in downtown is the courthouse. In fact, there was a Civil War battle where guys were shooting out of the little cupola there and stuff like that. It's really important. It was built in the 1850s, I believe. And what happened was some guy left town and he made a whole lot of money. And he came back and he made his little statement, I'm back. And you can't even appreciate it as much as when you're on the ground, how that just kind of dwarfs the most important building in town. So, and of course, if you've ever been to Meridian, they've got 2 of these parking garages that aren't even used as garages anymore, from what I recall. So that's something to avoid. Now, don't try this at home. This is my last one. Don't build second floor sidewalks. You really don't need them. Like one ground level is enough. You don't need 2. And that's what they did in Morristown, Tennessee. Now, this is not because of flooding or something like that. They just I think they got too much money that they thought, hey, we can double the amount of retail and dining and stuff if we do concrete sidewalks on the second level, which of course shades out the first level. Of course, you can't do trees, even holly trees, at that level. I was looking at this picture and I was thinking, okay, I must have taken this guy, I took these myself. I said, I must have taken these at 4th of July. I'm seeing all the bunting and stuff. But then I started looking, I'm like, wait a second. Maybe it's Christmas. Maybe they're just really patriotic. I don't know. But anyway, they're definitely out of touch with the second floor. So don't do that one, okay? I think we're pretty safe. Now, I want to switch. This is kind of the last topic here, but I spent a lot of time on implementation. And I want to say I feel your pain because, as Thomas said, my first job ever was as a downtown director in Pensacola long ago. And then I keep making this recurring mistake. What happens is, like in Clarksville, Tennessee, 2011, they had this downtown group on paper, but it wasn't a real entity. They'd never had staff. They just had a board. And they asked me to come lead them through a strategic plan, like a visioning process, and do a strategic plan. Not really a downtown master plan with a physical board, but more of a strategic plan. So I do that, right? And one of the things I came out with, I said, hey, you all need to have a staff person for your downtown group. Maybe it becomes a Main Street program, whatever, but you need staff, right? So I even helped them write the job description. We got resumes in, and at the 11th hour, the county didn't step up with their share of funding. So they turned to me and they said, hey, Phil, will you do it on an interim part-time basis? Because they knew I was a consultant, had other things to do. So I said, okay, thinking it would be 6 months maybe. Well, it lasted like 3 years. But I had to implement my plan, my strategic plan. I had to implement, like, oops, okay. Same thing, exact same thing in 2018. I lead this, it was more of a robust downtown master plan for Natchez. And exact same thing, the county didn't step up with their part of the money. And they turned to me and said, will you be an interim, I always call it interim part-time quasi-pseudo director? And I did. And the first year or two, I was actually pretty engaged. The last year, I've hardly done anything. The most striking thing about this slide, though, when I put it together, is that it occurred to me I must really like blue. Because if you look at the logos, and you look at my logo, there's like this common, it must say something about me. I have no idea what it is, but apparently I like blue, even my shirt. So fascinating. So on implementation, let me kind of set the stage first. So, there are a lot of different types of plans, and a lot of plans, depending on what it's for, aren't really about creating change. Like a citywide comprehensive plan. I actually did Starkville's plan, citywide comprehensive plan in 2016. And when you do a plan like that, and this is what we call the place types map, and when you do that kind of plan, what you're really doing is setting a framework, kind of a regulatory framework for growth that's driven by the private sector. You're not really trying to make it happen. It's just that if and when development comes, it's going to be like this, right? That's not the case with the downtown master plan. You want to make change, right? It's catalytic. You want things to happen. So that's one big important thing to keep in mind about a downtown plan. And, so what is it that constitutes successful implementation? Because whenever I talk about a plan, people go, well, Phil, was that plan implemented? It's never a yes or no answer. It's always a matter of degrees. I've seen very few plans where nothing was implemented. I've never seen a plan where everything was implemented. Your goal should be just to get as much implemented as you can until you update the plan maybe 5 years later. And it can occur over time. I mean, no one flips a switch and suddenly it's implemented. In fact, years ago, I was driving with my wife and daughter to Savannah. We were just south of there. And there's a little town called Midway, and I did a citywide comprehensive plan there a few years earlier. And I said, hey, we're not in a rush. You mind if I pull off and we drive around Midway? And we did, and Midway was still kind of tired. And there was some new development. It looked a little bit better, but, a plan doesn't dramatically change a place. As we were getting back on the interstate, my daughter, who was then like 8, she goes, Dad, your plan wasn't very good. And it's kind of like, well, wait a second. It needs a little time. It's not going to happen overnight. So I had to convince my daughter that I'm a better planner than she thought. But anyway, so here's kind of some tips, both before the planning, during the planning, and after the planning to get implementation to succeed. So one is to include an implementation section in the plan scope and budget. So if you hire somebody to do a plan, there's a detailed scope, and you need to just make sure that there's going to be an implementation section that's part of the plan, because it's not a given that it always will. So that's important. And typical issues that are addressed in that last section of the plan on implementation would be things like who are the responsible parties for implementing certain things, what's the sequencing, and then what's the funding source. So this is just like one page of a couple of pages at the end with an implementation matrix. This was Wilkesboro, North Carolina. And, I would categorize these by topic. So like buildings and facilities were A, transportation and public spaces B, then there were other things like, economic strategies on, another page. And, I just summarized the key recommendation, one sentence, refer back to the page numbers. So if you want to see the detail, you go to this page. Responsible parties, time frame. And usually it's like near term might be year 1, midterm is years 2 and 3, and then long term might be 4 and 5, or however you want to set it up. But those are the kinds of things that need to be addressed. Also, sometimes a city will include implementation as part of the actual scope, not just saying you got to address it in this plan, but after the plan you need to do X, Y, or Z. And that's what happened in Northport, Alabama, where we did a downtown riverfront plan. This is back in 2008. And but part of the scope was as soon as we did the plan, we rewrote all the zoning. And this is a pretty big area, really, so this is like the Black Warrior River, Tuscaloosa's right here. You got this highway here. The historic downtown is really right there. It's very small, and it kind of extends down to the riverfront where there used to be a cotton gin. I was there a couple days ago, actually, for the first time in years, and they've done some development down here now. That's fairly consistent with the regulations. But anyway, that's where you actually are going to have implementation, that is, the new code as part of the overall project. Also, during the planning, you will need to have a really robust public engagement process. So, and it's all about, as I mentioned before, it's really as much as anything about getting buy-in from the stakeholders so they're going to support the plan. They're going to want to see it adopted, and they're going to want to see it implemented. I led a plan for the Lower St. Charles neighborhood back around 2000, and I've never seen such a politically balkanized place in my life. Even the churches were at war with each other. It was kind of crazy, but we had a charrette. We did the workshop on the front end, and people who normally didn't speak to each other got together, and they built some consensus. So that was a great example. I call this the tale of two cities. So I led a plan for Vicksburg in the early 90s, shortly after they got casino gambling. And so I was with a firm out of Boston. And what happened there was Mayor Walker, who was a great guy, he was in office for about 3/4 of the project. Towards the end of the project, they had an election. He lost the election. And because there was hardly any public engagement process, especially at that time in the 90s, and somewhere like Vicksburg, there just wasn't a lot of public engagement. So the plan kind of went down in flames. Now, some things have been implemented from the plan, but not much, especially with regard to the location of casinos, which was very different than what we'd proposed by putting them downtown, tying them in with strong urban design linkages and things like that. Fast forward 7 years. So I'm leading a plan in Bryan, Texas, which is outside of College Station, where Texas A&M is. And same thing where we got about 3/4 of the way through the plan, maybe even further. They had an election. The mayor lost. A bunch of councilmen lost. The difference is they supported the plan, and the difference was public engagement. We had a lot of, we had the big charrette, and we did all these things. So there was this army of people who supported the plan. So the newly elected officials, they couldn't have done something otherwise. Even though we know a lot of new administrations like to get rid of whatever the previous administration did, they didn't have that option. Why? Because of a robust public engagement process. Another trick to getting implementation is if you have new places, like a new park or a new plaza, give it a name. You know why? It's kind of like if you have a field next to your house that you own and you have a cow on it, if you name that cow, it's probably not going to end up as hamburger on your dinner table at night, right? Because it's got a soul, once you give it that name. So in Natchez, when we did the plan, there's a kind of a triangle piece of, they call that, this is MLK Street, they call it the MLK Triangle. It's really just a paved area with an old building, that's the building right there, sitting there, and then there's this historic church right there. Well, Hiram Revels, who was the first African-American congressman, was the minister at the church just before he went to Washington. So, so we gave it the name Revels Plaza. There's a statue we're showing of them there. That's like new infill development. The rest is all kind of rehab of existing buildings. But that hasn't happened yet. We just did the plan in 2018, but I feel like it really will happen. And, it's got a name. Same thing in Fayetteville, Tennessee. We came up with 2 places that we named. One was this neighborhood plan we did, and the main street here was called Stockyard Street. Now, I could find no historic evidence that there were stockyards there, but there must have been, because who else would name it Stockyard Street, right? So when we came up with this plan for the neighborhood, we called it the Stockyard neighborhood, and I didn't get any pushback. Hopefully it doesn't smell like a stockyard when they develop it out. But the other one, there was a big demand for public restrooms and maybe like a little visitor center. So we did a plan here. This is a building, it's a small visitor center, public restrooms. It's on a kind of a corner location. And this is like a green space, and here's a plaza with a water feature there. And I named it Volunteer Plaza, and there's kind of 2 reasons. The main reason is because about a mile away, Andrew Jackson first pulled together his soldiers before they went to the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. And they did the same thing in the same place before the Battle of New Orleans. And, there was such an outpouring of soldiers that he mustered. They were called the Volunteer State because of that. So I thought, hey, well, let's call that Volunteer Plaza. You can do interpretive waysigns that tell the story. Plus, more importantly, the city manager, whose support was really critical for this, is a huge Tennessee Volunteer fan. I mean, the guy wears that weird orange color. It's not normal orange. He wears it. His office is full of, so I'm like, name it Volunteer Plaza. This dude's going to be all over it, and he was. So naming can be important. Making a fiscal case can be important, and not necessarily for an entire plan. We did this plan in High Point, North Carolina for this area. It was historically like the African-American downtown. John Coltrane was born and raised right by this little commercial area. So we came up with a streetscape plan, and we determined it would be approximately $1.3 million to do. So luckily we had an economist on the team like we normally do, and he did an estimate of what rehab of the area, according to the plan, would generate in revenues, property tax and retail tax revenue. And this is the amount, that they would spend on the, this is the revenue part of it. And you can see in year 1, there's still a shortfall, year 2, but by year 3, you're out of the red and into the black. They ended up doing it. Now, they didn't do the streetscape quite as nicely as what we designed there, and I have no idea on the numbers on the revenue because we weren't hired to, that would be a neat study, an academic study, but anyway, sometimes you have to make the case fiscally. Another thing is to identify potential funding sources even before you do the plan. Now, that's pretty unusual, but they did that in Gallatin, Tennessee. When we were hired to do a downtown plan, they said, look, we want to go after grants, so you got to come up with some projects that'll be, lend themselves to getting grants. So we did this big public square improvement. It was a $1.6 million project. They actually did it, and $1.3 million were in federal grants. They were like transportation enhancement funds. A farmer's market over here, which is mainly a pavilion, and they even use it not only for the farmer's market, but for like special events, bands play and that kind of thing, kind of like a stage. That was $200,000 project just to build the structure, and almost half of it was from a USDA grant because it was tied to a farmer's market. And then thirdly, the Greenway, which is back here along this creek, Town Creek, the vast majority of it was federal funding, again, transportation funding. So this is a town that said, hey, we want to get grant money through our plan, and they actually did it. Include one or more key plan graphics. And when I say key plan graphics, these are usually the kind of graphics that a typical consultant team can't do in-house. Oftentimes, you might have to hire an artist or somebody who can do them. So here's an example. The Douglas block, which is actually multiple blocks in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, we did this plan, and we actually used 2 different methods. One was this artist bird's eye rendering, right? And the main building in the whole area is the Douglas building. That's the Douglas building. That's how it appeared in the plan, before our plan. That was in our plan with a visual simulation. Now, I'm noticing now, I don't know if it looks clear, everything looks a little bit fuzzy, but hopefully you can see it okay. When they redid the building, it looks exactly like the after, except that instead of being dark blue, the canopies are black. But otherwise, it looked exactly, and the great thing was we used multiple types of, multiple techniques on the graphics. Same thing, this is Russellville, Arkansas. Here's this building that was kind of chopped up into different pieces. It was an old bank building. And luckily, we had a photograph of it from like 1911 or 1913, I can't remember when. And we did this visual simulation. A local developer saw it, got fascinated, acquired it, did a rehab that looks almost exactly like this, put it in a sports bar, totally changed the dynamics of their downtown. And I would say that one project is responsible for really getting downtown Russellville going, and it was all because of a graphic. But my favorite graphic story, first time I ever did a plan where I led where we put in, hired somebody separate to do a graphic. Well, it was for the Music Row area. That's Demumbrian Street. I don't know if you know Nashville at all, but downtown's over here. Vanderbilt's over here. And the key idea was this like roundabout. And we thought, if we don't have a graphic that's really strong, it's probably going to go nowhere. So we went back to the city and said, hey, could we get a couple $1,000 for a key graphic? And they're like, nah, we don't have the money. So I went to the main property owner in the area, and I started doing a song and dance for him. And he goes, Phil, stop. What's it going to cost? He says, I tell him $1,500. He pulls out a piece of paper and writes, I owe you $1,500 for artist rendering. Hands it to me. We went out and had it done. And the funny thing is there were actually some kind of flaws. Like, I hate this hotel that was proposed. It's really ugly, but it was already like approved. Now, it fell through and they never did it, but the city made us put that in there. Also, we should have had the roundabout in the foreground with the city skyline in the back, but the reason we didn't do that is we didn't want to say what the public art in the middle of the roundabout should look like, right? And you kind of have to go out on a limb, so we made it kind of vague and all that. But the cool thing is bombastic Richard Branson broke ground a couple of years ago for his Virgin Hotel, which is back here. It doesn't look just like that, but that's where it's located. And the area is totally turned around, and I'm still convinced if it wasn't for that $1,500 graphic, I don't think the plan would have gone anywhere. So pretty amazing what graphics can do. Also, create an implementation entity or expand an existing one as far as its resources. So, a lot of times these communities just don't have a downtown revitalization group, and they need one, or they don't have resources. Like in Tryon, I'm actually working in Tyrone, Georgia, too. In Tryon, North Carolina, they had a downtown group, they still do, but they didn't have staff. So my biggest recommendation was get staff. And once they did that, they've really turned things around. Here's a list of other places where we've recommended that they do an organization, and they did it. Wetumpka is one of the best. That was something we really made clear in our plan. And I Googled the Wetumpka Main Street program the other day, and they just won some awards through the state Main Street program. So that was kind of exciting. Also, leveraging available existing funding to implement the plan. And here's some examples. I talked about Gallatin, Wilkesboro, North Carolina. They did a farmer's market through a grant from the state. Wilson, North Carolina, though, is the most exciting. In that case, we did this plan, and we proposed the, quote, whirligig park. There's a guy named, he's passed away since, this guy named Wallace Simpson, who's internationally known for making whirligigs. These are these big metal sculpture things that kind of move with wind. And he had it out on his farm. And we said, we need to put it here. And here's the amazing thing, too. That piece of land that we're showing in the middle, and you can barely see the whirligigs. They're kind of at the corner. There's actually a whole bunch of them now since they developed it. But what's amazing to me is that it was a vacant piece of property, and we said put a park there. Now, it's really rare that a vacant piece of land really does make a good park. I know a lot of downtowns do it, and it's like, oh, there's a vacant lot, let's make it a park. Well, you need to be strategic, really strategic on where you locate a park, because you want to leverage benefit. But that vacant area really was a strategic location. So they did that. These old tobacco mills, they've since rehabbed and all sorts of uses. There's a microbrewery in there. But they've seen all this investment ever since the Whirligig Park went in. But as far as the funding, they raised $4 million in grants from the NEA, the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, and the State Arts Council. So pretty successful. Another one is to sponsor an RFP to develop a catalytic site like we did in Bristol, Tennessee. And in Bristol, there was this one site. It was multiple buildings. They called it the coin block. Here's the building. And we had three scenarios, most of it being preserved, partial preservation and some infill, and all infill, which we didn't really want to do, but we kind of had our hand forced on that one by the city. We also did not just sketches, but financial pro formas for all three scenarios. The good news is that they're redeveloping it and putting in, lofts and restaurants, and there's a courtyard and parking spaces and all this kind of stuff. The bad news is they tore down the buildings, and here's what the new infill is going to look like. It does come up to the street. There is some massing. The height's okay. Other than that, I don't think it fits in real well. But anyway, at least they got something going. Most of the people in the community are happy with this, to be quite honest. At least it's something happening. And it was through an RFP that was recommended in the plan. Same thing in Natchez. When we did the plan there, the city owns this little depot. You can barely see it here. It's located right there, okay? And in this rendering, it's right there. And in the plan, we recommended do an RFP process and turn it into a restaurant, right? Well, lo and behold, I ended up having to implement it, not knowing it at the time I did the plan. I wrote the RFP. I chaired the selection committee. We selected what we call the movie guys. Tate Taylor, I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's a director. He directed the movie The Help and Get On Up about James Brown, which they filmed in Natchez, and James Brown's not even from Natchez or even Mississippi. But anyway, they've been making these great investments, the movie guys, and so there's the groundbreaking. They're going to obviously keep the depot, but this is just like for the physical improvements around it. But again, it was from a plan that recommended an RFP, and they did it, and it's moving forward. Conduct periodic updates to the downtown plan. In Tryon, North Carolina, I did the strategic plan in 2015, and then they got the director on board, as I recommended. They brought me back in 2019, and just for an update, but they achieved so much because they had a director and they were doing an update. Russellville, Arkansas, it's kind of funny. In 2012, we did a plan. Their biggest issue was vacant, deteriorated buildings. By the way, they didn't regulate parking, on-street parking. We said, okay, this isn't an issue now because downtown's so dead, but you want to have a parking problem, so you better think about, regulating it for turnover, 2-3 hour turnover in the future. So in the plan in the back, we said, update the plan in 5 years. So 5 years later, I get a phone call, we're ready to update the plan. So we kind of got the old band together, went there, and did this update. And their biggest problem, they'd rehabbed all the buildings. Their problem was parking. They still weren't regulating it. So anyway, I guess that's a good problem. But you also have to be sure that you have the right folks in place to implement the plan. Because I showed you before that bank building that they rehabbed, that was a tax credit, investment tax credit project, which means the state, the SHPO had to oversee it and make sure it was done correctly. Well, the other rehabs they did, like this one, weren't done correctly. I mean, this is a typical storefront the way it should be. You've got these cast iron pilasters, you've got these wood paneled bulkheads, you've got the transoms haven't been painted over or covered. That's like what it should look like. They rehabbed this one, you got like concrete. I think those are still the cast iron, that's all they saved. But it's all this like brick and, reflective glass, and that doesn't look right. And the little snap-in muttons, they should be 1-over-1 windows instead of looking like Colonial Williamsburg crept into the downtown. So you got to have, the problem was they had a city engineer staffing the Preservation Commission. Same thing in Clarksville. They had a building inspector staffing, doing design review. At least in Clarksville, I got them to move it over to the Planning Commission because these people do design review all the time. You figure they're doing site plan review, subdivision review. So they have more of a, instinct to be able to do design review. So you got to have the right people in place. And then finally, celebrate the victories along the way to maintain your momentum. When a couple years after we did the Douglas Block plan, and they did all this great implementation, they had a 1-week celebration. They had, movies they showed at the Rehab movie theater, a ceremony, there was a big festival. This is the invite I got in the mail about all the stuff going on. But anyway, just to summarize, in conclusion, when it comes to building support and funding for a plan, just to recap what I've already said, recommend the downtown plan in another plan, like a comp plan. Organize a field trip to go see a model downtown, orchestrate a dog and pony show, but advertise it if you have to do that. With funding, start off with the city, maybe the county if you're a county seat, leverage existing funding programs, obviously. Don't forget about the private sector as potentially a funding source. And by the way, these dog and pony shows I was talking about, I do those sometimes to help communities get the support they need. Don't feel obligated to hire the consultant who's doing it. It's happened to me. My joke is that I'm great at creating other people, work, because I'll go in and convince the city, then they'll do an RFP. Sometimes I get selected, but guess what? Sometimes I don't. But that's a calculated risk on my part. It's just marketing. But that can be a good way to get the support you need. And then finally, on achieving implementation, before the planning, include an implementation section in the plan scope. Maybe even make actual implementation like a new code like they did in Northport, part of the scope and budget. During the planning, of course, you got to have a public engagement process that's robust. If you create new places, give it a name. You might make the fiscal case for the plan or some part of the plan. You might even identify funding sources before the plan, although that's not done that often. And it's really important to have key graphics in your plan because most people can't visualize what you're talking about. They got to see a picture. And then after the plan, creating a new entity or expanding an existing one is important. Leveraging existing funding. Sponsor an RFP, maybe for a catalytic site to help kind of jumpstart. Maybe you call it the Quick Victory Project that has high visibility and kind of builds momentum coming out of the gate with your new plan. Conduct periodic updates, roughly 5 years is best. And then celebrate when you have achievements. And that's it. And I just learned this animation feature. I'd never done that. So I can't help doing it. I just sit here and do this. But it is shameless self-promotion. Thomas mentioned that I did this book by the American Planning Association back in 2009. They don't publish books anymore, which is kind of cool because mine was the last book they ever did on downtown planning. And now it's this group called Rutledge, but they kind of took the place for APA's Planners Press. But anyway, there's a lot more stuff in there if you're interested.